Tom and Jerry, classic cat and mouse cartoon that first graced our screens way back in 1940. Tom and Jerry, the first video game based off the cartoon that first made its way into our homes in 1989.
Who would have thought it would take almost half a century just for someone to make a Tom and Jerry game? Nothing on Atari, nothing in the arcades, no Pac-Man clones. It just feels like something should have happened, but nope. Tom and Jerry Hunting High and Low, also simply known as just Tom and Jerry, is going to start us off being released on Amiga, Atari ST and the Commodore 64.
You can tell this was a while back because there are only 4 or 5 people credited on the start screen. You control Jerry, your goal is to collect cheese and escape via the mouse hole, all whilst Tom is giving chase. Classic cat and mouse. And it looks the part too, so at the very least, we've managed to capture the essence of the cartoon right from the get-go. Jerry's controls are fairly stiff, especially the jumping, which feels really inaccurate and oftentimes unresponsive. It's made worse by the furniture that I frequently find myself getting stuck on, or under, or around. It's not always easy to tell what can and can't be walked through. I'll find myself making a chore of jumping over an object, only to find I could have walked right by it. If, or should I say when, you do get caught, you lose 30 seconds from the time limit. Oh yeah, this is a time-limited game. As far as I can tell, the only way to get a game over is to just run the clock to 0. So I guess Tom just isn't that hungry today or something, because he's quite happy with just letting Jerry go after 30 seconds. Is that really what Jerry has been running from this whole time? Just having his time wasted? Jerry can defend himself. Some of the objects you find can be dropped on Tom's head, which will get him off screen for a while. Beat the level and you get a 3D bonus stage. You run through a tunnel and you collect cheese to regenerate a few seconds of time. From here on, it's rinse and repeat. Not much changes between each stage beyond the background. I'm not even certain what the requirements are to beat the game. Nothing seems to be keeping track of the amount of cheese collected, and it lets you progress to the next stage regardless of how much you get. The Atari ST offers a fairly similar experience to the Amiga. I'm sure I'll reignite some old playground rivalries by saying that in this case, the Atari ST version is a slight downgrade in all areas compared to the Amiga. Wait, you lose 30 seconds? They spelt it just fine on the Amiga version, so Atari ST fans, you gotta deal with a downgraded spelling version too. But yeah, gameplay issues are the same, level layouts are the same, it's a fairly straightforward port with all the pros and cons of the Amiga version. Now on to the Commodore 64 version of the game, and by 1989, the Commodore 64 was starting to get fairly dated, so just keep that in mind when we make comparisons. Visually, it's fine. It's still clearly Tom and Jerry, only Tom is a lot smaller now, but the level layouts seem pretty much intact. For some reason, the Commodore 64 got easy mode. This is like Tom and Jerry on story difficulty. The previous 2 versions, Tom can be quite difficult to avoid at times, but this time round, he hardly even tries. Sometimes he'll just stand there and look at Jerry. Kinda creepy. Rename this one Lazy Tom and Jerry. It does actually control a lot better. Jerry feels quite nimble. On the other systems, it's like he ate an anvil or something. And as you can imagine, this only makes the game easier. I actually beat this version. Halfway into the second stage, the game just stopped and congratulated me. It looked like it triggered when I collected some cheese, so if someone out there knows of the details of what you're supposed to do to beat the game, I'd love to just know what these winning criteria are. Okay, so now it's time for things to get a little confusing. Tom and Jerry 2 also released in 1989 for the exact same systems, plus the Amstrad CPC, the MSX, and the ZX Spectrum. The problem and confusing part is it also had another title in some areas of the world. Tom and Jerry, the same title as the previous game, on the same systems, in the same year. Here's the Amiga version. Notice anything? Basically the same game. Same on Atari ST2. It's not really a sequel or a new game at all, more like an expansion pack. You've got some new stages, and that's it. Everything else works identically. So my review of these is basically the same as before, though we do have 3 more systems to add into the mix. I'll start with the Amstrad, since I actually own one of these, and this is easily the roughest one yet in terms of the sound quality. And I mean, none of these exactly have a soundtrack you're going to pick up the vinyl of anytime soon, but this music is so grating that you end up thankful it doesn't play during the gameplay. Controls have become a mess. If you jump in place, it's like you're on the moon, but jump whilst moving and it may as well be a teleport because it's so quick. Speaking of the moon, sometimes Tom will just moonwalk off screen for a while. He's somewhat similar to his Commodore 64 counterpart in that he seems fairly indifferent towards Jerry. I did notice these boxes with green eyes on them that I didn't notice before in the other version. Maybe they're new for the sequel, or maybe I just didn't realise they were there before, but they turned Jerry invisible. Honestly, the last thing Jerry needed in this version was another advantage over Tom. Let's check out the MSX version. I'm not even sure I've played an MSX game before. I have no idea what happened with this one. And I may not have played much MSX, but I'm fully aware that it's capable of way better than this. It's horrible. Everything is in slow motion. Jerry can blend into the background. Jumping only works when Jerry feels like it. And there's absolutely no sound. Or at least I thought there wasn't until this happened. You can just imagine what that was like after I'd gotten used to complete total silence. It scared the hell out of me. Why only have the sound kick in at this specific point? The 3D section reminds me of one of those old LCD games. It's bordering on slideshow levels of gameplay. You can hardly tell what bits are cheese anyway with the state of the colour in this game. I was so convinced that I was having compatibility issues that I just looked for footage on YouTube, and yep, it's genuinely this bad. I didn't mess up. This is it. This is Tom and Jerry on the MSX, the same system that brought us the original Metal Gear. Last and almost least is the Spectrum version. For those not familiar with the system, these are the kind of graphics you would expect from the aging 8-bit computer, so forgive the rough visuals more than, say, what we had on the MSX. The crucial part, however, the gameplay, does still suffer. It's super slow, like the MSX version, with even worse collision detection and jumping. I really wanted to see what the 3D stage would look like here, but I kept getting trapped in the same place. Crazy thing is, Tom didn't even bother coming after me, and I still couldn't make it through to the end of a level. That's the only time that's happened so far. If only Cartoon Tom knew Jerry's real weakness. Tables.
With so many home computers around at the time, it would have been like a big debate over which system got the definitive version of the game, but I'm going to go with the Commodore 64 as that was at least the best version to play. Amiga and Atari ST do have the best visuals, but not quite as smooth to play, and overall worst goes to the Spectrum, with special mention there to the MSX. Amstrad just kinda sits in between, I guess. It felt like it was going to be the worst until Spectrum and MSX versions came along.
Looking at reviews from the time, the September 1989 issue of Zap 64 magazine gave the Commodore 64 version 43% and the Amiga version only 27%, mentioning repetitive gameplay and disappointing graphics on the Amiga. They expected more from the Amiga, which makes a lot of sense given that it costs more than double what the Commodore 64 version did. And hey, with new games, price matters. Anyway, after playing multiple versions of the same game, I'm quite ready to move on. Tom and Jerry Yankee Doodle's CAT-astrophe, see what they did there, comes along in 1990 exclusively for MS-DOS, so at least I don't have about 10 versions to switch between this time. It's the same kind of idea as before, play as Jerry, avoid Tom, makes a lot of sense. You set the difficulty and time limit and then go for a high score. Survive to gain points over time, and lose points by being caught or trapped by Tom. Graphically, it looks okay. It looks about as close to a cartoon as a 1990 video game is going to get, but it's way too basic for the gameplay. Most demos offer more content than this. It really needs some more variety. This is the only stage in the game, and nothing about it actually changes. It really doesn't take a lot of time to exhaust all of the options. A 2-player mode would have been nice as well. Could have given the game a little bit more replay value. It even looks like it's made to be 2 players, but nope. Tom is always the computer-controlled character. Controls for Jerry are kind of iffy. Outside of movement, I struggle to get anything to work. Holding the enter key jumps, I figured that one out, but then there are times like this. I assume I'm supposed to be able to throw eggs back at Tom, but even after mashing every button on the keyboard, all Jerry seems to do is dodge. The best part is when Jerry gets in a vehicle. Yeah, Jerry can drive, because you get to run down Tom. Overall, a neat idea, but super bare bones in execution, even for the time period. On to a new year, 1991, and a new game. Now, on the NES. Tom and Jerry, the ultimate game of cat and mouse, or just Tom and Jerry and Tuffy. Guess they couldn't fit the whole title on the screen. Hell yeah, after what I've been playing, this is a breath of fresh air. Classic 8-bit side-scrolling, maybe not at its finest, but still a good effort. Tom has kidnapped Tuffy, so now you play as Jerry to save him. Stages are reasonably sized with lots of nooks and crannies to explore. They're not quite linear. You can and most likely will end up backtracking, even if unintentional, due to the sometimes confusing layouts. This is one of those games that suffers from is that a platform-itis? You know, where some background objects look like they should be able to be jumped on, but you can't. You can find cheese which will contribute points towards your score, with the bigger pieces recovering some health as well. Jerry's main weapon is this infinite supply of marbles, which he throws in a downward angle. There's a lot of 8-bit platformers that have attacks like this. I've never been a fan, because I end up having to come to a complete stop when I see an enemy, of which there are many in this game, and trying to time jumping with attacking just to hit them. Speaking of enemies, there's a good variety of size-appropriate foes for Jerry. Most hurt you if you touch them, as you'd expect, but others, like the bee, just knock Jerry back with no recovery time. Get in the wrong position and these guys are more dangerous than the enemies that actually hurt you. Oh, and there's fall damage too, which is a frustrating feature to include in a platformer with very vertical levels. There's a ton of enemies, so do I really need to be fighting against the stage itself as well? Thankfully, when you die, you continue right where you left off, which is a pretty generous feature for the time. Most games back then were sending you back to the start of a level or a checkpoint. The music is absolutely insane. It's honestly got some great 8-bit tunes, but damn, for Tom and Jerry, sure. Why not? This also got a release on MS-DOS in '93, 2 years after the NES version came out. Graphically, it's improved, but performance is noticeably worse. It doesn't play anywhere near as smooth as on the Nintendo. Everything's here still, same level layouts, same items, but no music. Talk about going from one extreme to the other. Now we're sitting in near total silence. If you're gonna play one, just go with the NES. 1992 saw the first of our Game Boy releases, simply titled Tom and Jerry. It's got the theme, and it's hardly the worst visual representation of the cartoon we could have gotten, considering the platform. This time, Tuffy is lost instead of kidnapped, not that you really needed to know. It's a pretty basic, if reasonably executed, platformer. I probably don't need to tell you at this point that, yeah, you play as Jerry. You avoid all the household hazards, and Tom, who occasionally pops out from behind an object to try and grab you. This is the only time you'll really be seeing Tom in the game, which is kind of a shame, so no boss battles or chases this time around. Jerry doesn't seem to have any method of defending himself, no marbles this time, and the old faithful platforming tradition of jumping on top of an enemy, that doesn't work either. All you can do is jump and sprint, neither of which can be used offensively. Jerry's health is indicated through his portrait in the corner, kinda like Doom of all things, and if you take a hit, the music transitions to a more intense, panicky theme. There's plenty of items to pick up too, although 90% of what you find will be cheese, which just act as points, but there are 6 pickups overall, and well, wait a minute, I guess I lied earlier because it turns out, yes, you can get those marbles, but they're hidden around in the stage and limited to just 6 shots. Honestly, I don't think they're worth the hassle of seeking out specifically, as the enemies are not nearly as much of a threat as all of the obstacles and general platforming are. The rest of the pickups are fairly standard stuff: health, lives, extra time since we're time limited again. I found as the game went on, there's way too much of a reliance on just leaps of faith. Literally having to jump into oblivion and hope that there's a platform at the bottom instead of a pit or just some spikes. It's a platformer, you want it to be about skill, not just getting lucky. So a quick skip ahead in time just for a minute, all the way to 1999 to look at the Game Boy Color version of Tom and Jerry. This is more of a remaster than a separate game. It's identical to the one we just looked at, but now with added colour, as you'd hope, which to be fair does make a massive difference to all of the visuals. And now every time you beat a level you get a bonus stage. Not really sure why other than to break up the monotony a little bit. If you're gonna just play one though, there's no reason to not go with the Game Boy Color. "1992 was a pretty big year for Tom and Jerry, and not because of the Game Boy game, but because that is when the world got cursed with the very first Tom and Jerry movie. This is the movie where, for God knows what reason, they had Tom and Jerry talk.
I'm Tom.
I'm Jerry.
You talk!
It's not good, and that's all you need to know. Naturally, being the early 90s, there was a video game tie-in, Tom and Jerry the movie on the Sega Master System. Oh my god. You play as Tom. Finally, we're the cat in the cat and mouse game. And yeah, the goal is to catch Jerry, who's taunting Tom from the other side of the screen whilst constantly running to the right. Jerry will lay traps along the way, which can be quite tough to avoid if you're running at full speed. There's also a bunch of platforms and obstacles blocking Tom's way that need to be avoided. It's one of those games where anything and everything is just out to kill you. Cups, frogs, fish. Tom is a cat, and the fish are killing him. You can only sprint and jump, not that you'd have time to stop and start a fight with anything anyway. It's just platforming skill at its purest. You're far more likely to die by missing a jump or lagging behind than any of the traps or enemies. For the most part, it's pretty doable, but it can get tricky sometimes. Jumping isn't always as precise as you want it to be, and you come to a complete stop before you fall, which just wastes precious time and progress. Oh, and we can't talk about this game without mentioning that it does look outstanding. Really colourful, with no two areas looking the same. Easily the best looking 8-bit offer we've seen. Tom and Jerry the movie also saw a release on the Game Gear. It's fundamentally the same game, but with completely new stages and some altered controls. Tom can no longer sprint, instead one button is for jumping and climbing, and the other one is to pounce at Jerry. If you don't catch Jerry with a pounce, you lose some health, which is a little bit harsh. These control differences make me lean towards the Master System version. That feels like a pretty good game, whereas the Game Gear release, I don't know, it's a little bit iffy. And on to another one that's simply titled Tom and Jerry. This time it's our first Super Nintendo outing. Well, Jerry's back with his green marbles. He's deadly with those things. At least they fire in a straight line this time. Plus, jumping on enemies actually works for once too, which is especially useful here as the marbles now have limited ammo again, so you've got to pick up more to use them. Cheese makes its comeback as the standard pickup, once again split into small pieces which act like your standard side-scrolling coin-style pickup, and bigger pieces restore health. It's all a little bit basic for a Super Nintendo platformer. By this time you'd be expecting just a little more. Each stage is split into 3 separate levels, with a boss fight against Tom when you reach the end of those 3 levels. Giant Tom is pretty cool to look at, but the rest of the game is fairly uninspired. The levels lack variety and get bland pretty quickly. The environments and level design are so similar sometimes that it's hard to tell the difference between them. I would often find myself thinking a level was repeating itself. Sometimes the level design outright works against you. Just a mass of identical platforms flooding the screen. Music and sound effects are also a little bit disappointing. Just generally a bit dated for the time, not really taking advantage of what the Super Nintendo is capable of. It's an okay game for a younger audience, simple to control, generally pretty easy, but too bland and unimaginative to be worth investing much time into.
Notice how I said this was our first Super Nintendo outing. Even though this was technically the only Super Nintendo Tom and Jerry game to get released, we did almost have another.
Starting life as Tom and Jerry 2, we know that there was a game scheduled to come out sometime in 1995, developed by Software Creations, even though the first game was made by different developers. During development, the game went from Tom and Jerry 2 to Tom vs. Jerry. The chase is on. What you're seeing here is one of the 2 prototypes found in Germany. It seems like a pretty neat idea. Needless to say, I can't exactly be too hard on it, as it's an unfinished game. Controlling Jerry, you run like hell from Tom as he makes chase, collecting cheese for points, and the occasional pickup that acts as a weapon. There's only a few levels, and they all have the same background and a fairly basic layout, but it is a pretty promising start, and already more interesting, with more impressive visuals and sound than the first Super Nintendo game. It's a shame it never came to be. It would have been very interesting to see what became of the finished product. Frantic Antics came along on the Game Boy first, so it's up first. For the very first time, we're playing as Tom and Jerry. For the 9 millionth time, we're playing a platformer. This is all starting to feel really familiar. Actually, I'm pretty sure we're seeing quite a few reused assets at this point. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but playing all of these back to back does make it more noticeable. As you saw, Jerry collects cheese, Tom collects fish, which at the very least don't hurt him this time. Actually, they heal you slightly. Levels are based on the movie, along with some of the other characters that actually make an appearance. Sometimes you have other objectives outside of just getting to the end, usually involving finding and collecting an item that's been hidden around the level and then delivering it to one of the characters. No marbles to throw this time around. Instead, we get this awkward rolling attack. I hate trying to get it to work, and you have no choice either because, once again, jumping on enemies has no effect. You get a running start and press down and B, and sometimes the roll will trigger. But don't rely on it. Sometimes it'll work without much of a run-up at all, sometimes it just won't happen no matter how far you've ran. Problem is, most enemies hang out on these small platforms anyway, so it's not worth risking an attempt at an attack, because you'll just end up taking more damage constantly attempting to roll than you end up dishing out. This could have been an okay game, but this method of attack kind of spoils it a bit. If you treat it like a plain old platformer, maybe it's worth giving a shot. Ignore that you can attack the enemies like half the games you couldn't before, and there's enough variation in the level design to at least keep it from getting boring. As for the Mega Drive version, straight away the title screen clearly shows the movie tie-in. Though to be fair, so few people had seen the film, it's unlikely anyone even noticed. This is a game I'd best describe as meh. As with the Game Boy version, you alternate between Tom and Jerry in a relatively underwhelming side-scrolling platformer. At first, it gave the impression of variety, but you do start to notice a lot of repetition as you get further in the game. That annoying roll attack is no more. Now you can pick up throwable weapons, not that the game likes you to have any. You'll find plenty of fish and cheese scattered about, which functions the same as on the Game Boy, but the weapons are often too little too late. They're also just kinda strange. Maybe it's a movie reference, I don't know, but Tom's primary weapons are footballs, and Jerry throws cartons of milk. At first I was like, okay, maybe we're going for something kid-friendly, but then within 10 seconds of the first stage, I'm being blasted at by a rat with a freaking shotgun, and these guys turn up forevermore, so it's hardly much of a fair fight. This is one of those games that really flew under the radar, and it's easy to see why. There's nothing particularly special or appealing. Being movie-based, as much as they seem to want to hide it, means that Tom and Jerry are working together, which is cool, in that it gives the chance to offer a co-op two-player mode. I'm always up for that. But it also kind of takes away the unique selling point a Tom and Jerry game can offer. A bit of cat and mouse with some added cartoon violence.
So now we hit a kind of cut-off point between the older and newer generations of Tom and Jerry games, I guess. We've had Tom and Jerry games come out every single year between 1989 all the way through to 1993, but now, with the exception of that Game Boy Color remaster in 99 that I played earlier, we don't get another title based on Tom and Jerry for another 7 years. Yeah, it's the new millennium, we're entering the third dimension, and I have an excuse to bust out my Nintendo 64. Let's go for it.
Our first 3D outing is Tom and Jerry in Fists of Furry. Get it? Furry? Now, hats off to them. It's not a bad looking game. Sure, by 2000 we were entering a new generation, but for the Nintendo 64, this is pretty decent. It's a one-on-one 3D fighter. Plain and simple. No story, no reasoning, pure all-out chaos, which I suppose isn't exactly unlike the cartoons. Before I started playing, I saw a review from Nintendo Power that claims that this is the best 3D fighter on the Nintendo 64. Nah, it just isn't. It clearly isn't. Now yeah, the visuals aren't too bad, but other than that, I honestly can't tell what in the hell they were talking about. This is the year 2000, we've had Super Smash Bros. There are standards that have been set, and this doesn't even come close. And what, I guess they're classing Super Smash Bros. As technically a 2D fighter, but how specific do you have to get? What we're going to do, we're going to say this is the best Tom and Jerry 3D fighting game released in the year 2000 on the Nintendo 64. Like, it's just trying too hard to make this sound way better than it is. So anyway, I'll start from the top. When you first start the game, you'll notice that your only options are Tom or Jerry, with 5 unlockable characters for later on. A little bit limiting, but it's fine. It's not exactly unusual for a fighting game to have locked characters. So I get to my very first fight, and my opponent leaves. Like, just leaves. I mean, look at him. He's going. He's out of here. Have you ever had that before? Have you ever been playing a fighting game and your opponent just decides they're done? They're done with the meaningless violence now. They're going home. This is my first major problem. The AI players just jump around continuously to the point that they bug out the game. It's like the AI has a button stuck on its own controller. To be fair on the game though, it's not like there's a massive variety of moves to pick from anyway. All characters are effectively the same, so the unlockables are basically just alternate costumes. You can punch, jump, and pick up weapons. There appears to be a very vast selection of weapons, all themed nicely to each stage as well. The problem is, they mostly work the same. Pick them up, throw them at the enemy, sometimes you can equip them and hit the enemy a few times, but those ones don't show up as often. With no forms of special moves, and the punch being unreliable and fairly weak, each round just ends up becoming a race to see who can throw more junk at the other. A question mark icon will occasionally appear. You can pick them up for a little buff, like a shield, or invisibility, which is useless because you're not actually invisible, but whatever. I don't know, there's just not really much to do. This game is lacking in content massively. For a fighting game to really have staying power, you really need the characters to have their own movesets. That would make a massive difference. At least there would be a reason to want to play through the game as somebody else. Now, you may get some entertainment out of multiplayer, but remember it is strictly 1 versus 1, again hindering what could have been a much more enjoyable experience. Nintendo 64 magazine summed it up nicely. After a mere 5 minutes of playing, you know you've picked up a real stinker of a game. The sheer shallowness of the experience is enough to drive you mad, as bout after bout, you employ the exact same tactic, sliding around the floor battling against inexcusably unresponsive controls and laughable collision detection. Yep, they nailed it. And I suppose I can't forget about the PC version of the game. Do take note though, we're starting to get to a point in time where multi-platform titles are pretty much the same between all the different ports. And that's almost the case here. We do have a couple of noteworthy differences though, primarily being the complete lack of music. Originally I was going to criticise the repetitiveness of the Nintendo version's music, but the total absence on PC gave me a new appreciation for it. Outside of that, well, the AI is a lot better. Your opponents no longer spam jump to the point where it breaks the game anymore. And in general, the AI is decent enough at, actually trying to play the game. So you could say this makes for a better overall experience if you just pop some music on in the background and change up the controls, because the default keyboard controls are awkward and not intuitive at all. So quite a lot of prep work just to make this mediocre game feel reasonably playable. In the very same year, we got another Tom and Jerry game. This time over on the PS1, Tom and Jerry in Housetrap.
This game I do actually have a very brief memory of. I never played it, but I do remember flicking through the official PlayStation magazine way back, and it's standing out as having been given a score of 1 out of 10. Now, I have the magazine still right here, but I won't read through the review just yet, so I can experience it for myself, but you can imagine where my expectations lie.
So here we go. There's not a huge number of options to start with, just jump straight into the game and start on the first level. You play as Jerry, no choice in the matter this time around, who is represented on the top screen, and Tom, always AI controlled, is on the bottom screen. Kinda looks like Spy vs Spy, if anyone remembers that. Fight across the stage, utilise weapons that you find laying around the house. You can hold 3 at once, and they take one of 2 forms, either a melee weapon or a thrown object. And that's it, just fight, or I suppose more specifically, find each other first and fight. Controls are okay, graphics are passable, nothing special, but hardly hideous. Tom isn't the smartest. In my first fight, he got himself beaten by the vacuum cleaner, and I wasn't even in the same room. There's plenty of times I just found him effectively ignoring my presence. Once you beat him, you move on to the next level, which is the exact same level as before, but with an extra room opened up. It's a little bit lazy just having this one stage that slowly expands over the course of the game. Especially since, even after everywhere has been unlocked, it's not the biggest stage. Sometimes they change things up a little bit, like this stage where you have to rescue ducklings from being slaughtered by Tom. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Sometimes your characters will just interact with the environment completely unprompted, leaving them totally vulnerable for the whole duration. It's pointless and frustrating. The TV and radio hardly stand out as dangerous objects that you should be trying to avoid. It's a really strange form of artificial difficulty.
Alright, I'll actually read the review now, so... I was already on the right page, and I flicked right by it, thinking there's no way I could possibly open it at the right page, right? But nope, there we are. Tom and Jerry in Housetrap, the review. Let's see what it says. It's brain-rottingly dull, and is essentially a carbon copy of 1988's Spy vs Spy, only not as good. Exactly what I said. It's also painfully frustrating. Stray too close to the telly and your character will stop to watch it for a few seconds. Yeah, that annoyed me too. Tom and Jerry should be ashamed of themselves for consenting to this rubbish. 1 out of 10, and they actually break it down here. Graphics get 3 out of 10, and then the gameplay and lifespan get 1 out of 10 each. So, not liked too much by PlayStation Magazine, issue number 69.
But at the end of the day, the real question is it a 1 out of 10? I don't know. I feel like I've played worse games just for this video. It's pretty bad, don't get me wrong, and the level of content especially is really poor. But overall, it's not 1 out of 10 bad. I feel like there's some fun to be had in 2-player, and that alone is enough for it to score a little bit higher.
So Tom and Jerry's first 3D outings have been a little bit iffy. Nothing special, that's for sure. Well, 2000 must have been the year of Tom and Jerry games, because we have 2 more. But now, back on Game Boy Color, so we're going 2D again with Mouse Attacks and Mouse Hunt.
Mouse Attacks is, surprise surprise, a side-scroller where you play as Jerry. In each level, you're trying to rescue one of your friends from Tom. Every stage has a golden item to collect. Collect enough of them and you can go through one of these doors. In these doors you'll find a minigame. Beat the minigame and you'll be given a special usable item as a reward. These items help you progress by accessing new areas of the level, and you can repeat the minigames as often as you need to in order to stock up. The minigames themselves are pretty simple, like solve the top half of this sliding puzzle. I guess the whole thing would be too tough for kids. Maybe later in the game they make you solve the whole thing. The dodging sequences have this cool 3D effect going for them. Not bad for the Game Boy Color. It's actually a pretty decent little puzzle platformer, but it is let down by being really short. It's only 5 levels long, and if it wasn't for the usable items being in limited quantity, it would be even shorter. Not too bad, again, a good one for a younger audience, although I don't know how many kids you're going to find out there playing Game Boy Color these days. Let's move on to Mouse Hunt, which I must say, if nothing else, it's at least a new idea. It didn't start too promising. Tom and Jerry's faces on the start screen look like they're melting. Their features are missing outlines. How does that happen to a cartoon? Anyway, you could play as Tom or Jerry, competing against the other in collecting mice. Tom chucks them into his bed to capture them, and Jerry into his mouse hole in order to try and save them. Though the game doesn't really differ much between each character. You're given a target number of mice to acquire and a time limit. First player to the target, or whoever has the most when the time runs out, is the winner. Pretty simple, easy to follow, and there's a ton of different stages with varied environments and littered with all these weapons you can use against your opponent. The level variety is great, but the weapons are cool enough, I guess, but I found them a waste of time. You can only hold one object at a time, so if you have a weapon, you can't collect mice. So you might prevent your opponent from getting a mouse, but you haven't achieved anything either. When you do get hold of a mouse, throwing them into Tom's bed can be quite annoying. Half of the time, they'll just fly straight over it, or not quite be pixel perfect enough to count as being captured. So I suppose there's one difference between the two characters. Sometimes the controls are a little on the clunky side. You can feel like you're having to really force the movement one moment, and then it's like you're on an ice rink the next. None of this majorly detracts from the overall experience. It's still a reasonably fun, pick it up and play for 1 or 2 rounds kind of game. The real sin though, there's no 2-player option. This is single player only, and it would have been a far better experience in multiplayer. The combat elements for one would have been way more fun, but oh well, I guess you can't win them all, and you can't help but feel just a little bit cheated out of the experience that this game seems like it was made for. We've had things in colour, now it's time to go advanced. We're on to the Game Boy Advance for our next Tom and Jerry entry, Tom and Jerry The Magic Ring, from 2002. It's directly based on a direct-to-video movie of the same name, which I assume these are all supposed to be stills from. Once again, we've got the choice of Tom or Jerry, which is always nice, which is still one of the rarer features in a Tom and Jerry game. What we have here is our very first beat-em-up, and no complaint from me, I'm a massive fan of old-school beat-em-ups, but damn, the stages are tiny. Just these small little areas that act more like an arena than an actual full level. Most of the time, you have to beat every single enemy in the area in order to progress. Now, you may be thinking that's not unusual for a beat-em-up, but this just keeps lulling you into a false sense of security. You think you've beaten them all, but no, they just keep on coming wave after wave. You end up spending way too long in the same little room. Thankfully, there are a decent variety of environments, presumably from the movie, with their own unique enemies, weapons, and little gimmicks. Unfortunately, the real weak point is the combat. Hit detection leaves a lot to be desired, and when you do make a hit, the enemies always have to do some overly long animation before you can hit them again. So it just ends up taking 2 or 3 times as long as it really should, just to beat one basic enemy. Look at this, for example. These are the first enemies you encounter in the entire game, and it's already a chore just to take them down. You can pick up weapons, which does make things a little easier, especially the ranged ones like the bombs. Chuck one of those into a pack of enemies and you'll save yourself a hell of a lot of time. On top of all this, they try to sneak in a few platforming sections. I don't know why, because the game clearly was not built with this in mind. It's just a mess. The game doesn't have any idea whether or not you've made it onto a platform. You'll fall through them at random with no pattern. It's a nightmare to play. The amalgamation of all of these issues is the circus stage, so try and keep up. Immediately you get greeted by clowns, the clowns pick you up, slowly carry you to a cannon, fire the cannon onto a tightrope above the stage that has 1,000,000 monkeys on it. The monkeys knock you back down again, another clown will pick you up, and rinse and repeat. It's absolute chaos. What the hell am I supposed to do? Well, the answer is play Tom and Jerry in War of the Whiskers, also released in 2002, but this time on the PS2. Ooh, load times. Well, when it eventually lets you play, it's essentially the direct sequel to Fists of Furry, so you'll already know what to expect on a very basic level. It does look a lot better, as you'd hope, being up a whole console generation, and there's a little bit more going on this time around. The core gameplay and the big variety of stages have returned. Now we've also got a few more characters to play as, and they all feel a little different to play to one another. At least more than last time by a long shot. You can even mix things up a little more with some alternate costumes. There have been some tweaks made to the gameplay. You can grab opponents and throw them into breakable areas on the arena. You can block, you can taunt, you can even charge up more powerful attacks, and build up a meter to activate Berserk mode, where you basically just ignore all incoming attacks. Another new feature is a whole new game mode, tag battles, which are way less chaotic than I first imagined, because you are tagging in and out. It's not 4 characters all on screen at the same time, as I hoped. It can be quite an unforgiving game. Hit detection, once again, just isn't where it needs to be. The AI automatically makes a beeline for any weapon in the arena and will just kick your ass immediately with pinpoint accuracy if you're not well prepared. Unfortunately, with all the gameplay changes made, the only real way to combat the AI's tactics are to do the same thing but quicker. The really crazy thing about the game? This got a T for teen rating in the US, so I guess I can't even argue that it's too hard for kids to play. I mean, really? T for teen? I guess for the level of violence? But it's cartoon violence. I swear, I've seen way worse get lower ratings than this. And think about it, this is 2002. Can you really imagine there are that many teenagers picking up a Tom and Jerry game over something like Time Splitters 2, Ratchet and Clank, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4? Tom and Jerry just ain't gonna compete. So I've complained a fair bit about the game, but honestly, if you ditch the computer and play it in multiplayer, you'll end up with one of the better Tom and Jerry games so far. It's not amazing. Help, it's not even really that good, but with a level playing field, It's a fun little arena fighter. And some advice? Look up the cheat codes to unlock all characters and arenas. You'll avoid ever having to play as the AI again, and just focus on some brief multiplayer fun.
So this here is actually the very last Tom and Jerry title to make it to home consoles. It did get an Xbox and GameCube release exclusively in North America, just in case you thought I forgot about those. And yep, we do get some appearances from Tom and Jerry in things like multiverses from this point onwards. When it comes to games based solely on Tom and Jerry, we're going exclusively handheld from this point onwards. So, back to the Game Boy Advance in 2003 for Tom and Jerry in Infernal Escape.
Now this one fascinates me just because there's no critical reviews from the time, at least absolutely nothing I can find, nothing on websites, nothing in magazines. A totally ignored game, despite being part of a big franchise, being on a really successful system during a peak time for the Game Boy Advance. It starts out with a fairly rough-looking slideshow pulled straight from the Heavenly Puss short from 1949. Forget that this is called Tom and Jerry. Jerry may as well not exist. It should have just been called Tom in Infernal Escape. The focus of each level is just getting all of the collectibles. It's either going to be collecting bones or freeing cats. They're not really hidden or anything, you just grab them as you make your way through the fairly mundane environments, all 2 of them. There may be 9 levels in this game, technically, but it's more like there's just 2 split into smaller stages. The first half of the game is Dog Boot Camp, and the second half is set in a castle. It all comes across as pretty lazy. Getting in your way will be a few enemies, some platforms, walls and doors that you need to blow up or find a switch to open. Nothing special, very typical obstacles, nothing really standing out. The controls fit the theme so far in that they're not a disaster, but they're still on the clunky side. You're going to want to come to a complete stop before jumping or attacking if you want either action to actually happen reliably. Otherwise, it's very 50-50 as to whether you'll see any success. There's only one weapon in the game, which is a club, but really it's just easier to ignore all of the enemies and jump past them. Again, not the first game we've seen that happen in. It's just not worth the hassle of getting into a fight. They always end up being back and forth, so you just end up taking a hit. You can reasonably beat this game in an hour or 2, so at least you won't have to be too patient with it. Oh, and for such a small game, it has the most over-the-top password system. You've got 3/4 of the alphabet, all the single-digit numbers, playing card suits, smiley faces, just all sorts going on. It takes as long to enter a password as it does to beat a level. It's no wonder critics skipped this one at the time. There's a whole bunch of awesome GBA games coming out in 2003. This one doesn't even enter the shuffle, let alone get lost in it.
Our next 2 games were released exclusively on mobiles back in the mid-2000s, so just take note, I will be playing through emulation, and back in the day, everyone would have had a slightly different experience playing these depending on what phone they had. The screen and the buttons in particular would have made a big difference playing these games, and I might actually have an easier time than most people would have because the buttons on my keyboard here are probably a hell of a lot more responsive than what you would have got on those old Nokia and Motorola phones.
In 2004, we get Tom and Jerry Cheese Chase. Now, my phone of choice from 2004 was the Motorola Razr V3. Anyway, here you go. Mobile gaming nearly 2 decades ago. Visually, it's actually not too shabby. It looks nice and cartoony, it's very clear what this is supposed to be, and in terms of the gameplay, it's exactly what it looks like. A Pac-Man clone in all of its glory. Collect all the cheese while being chased by a bunch of Toms. It would have been nice to use different cats, like how Pac-Man has different coloured ghosts, but it's no big deal. 4 Toms are scarier than 1. Instead of the power pellets, you pick up a weapon to use, like a hammer or an anvil. Considering the context of the game, it's an inoffensive little pastime that actually captures the spirit of the cartoon. Not too bad. Tom and Jerry Food Fight comes along in 2005. So here we have, as you would expect, another simple little game. Bounce the food onto the box, don't let it hit the floor. As you advance through the game, more food will get thrown at you all at once, with each food item bouncing with a different rhythm. And that's about it. There's not a huge amount to say. Try and get a high score whilst sitting in a dentist waiting room or something. It does exactly what you'd expect from a mobile game at the time. So, complaining about its simplicity would be like complaining that trees are made of wood. It's just the way it is. Let's mix things up and take a little dual-screen detour to play Tom and Jerry Tales on the Nintendo DS from 2006. The title screen is promising, it looks decent enough for the DS, but guess what, it goes downhill. I mean, when I'm pointing out the title screen as one of the positives, yeah, you could probably guess as much. So there's 4 different modes to play through each level, with each level being a room in the house. That sounds like a lot more content than it actually is. It's all like an illusion, because the whole game can actually beat in an hour or so. The main gameplay mode is Touch Time. Jerry runs along on rails, avoiding obstacles, and occasionally completing a quick time event, which effectively plays out as a short cutscene with Tom. These are by far the best bits of the game, and well matched with the cartoon. It's just a shame that these are only seconds worth of gameplay. The other modes are Time Mode, Speed Mode, and Break Mode. They all involve Jerry running around on rails. Time Mode is just getting through the stage as quickly as possible while avoiding the obstacles. In Speed Mode, you have a jetpack and fly through rings. That's about as much fun as it sounds. And I don't quite understand why it's called Speed Mode. Why not call it Jet Mode or Fly Mode? I don't know. Break Mode involves you collecting cheese and throwing it at objects to break them. Why Jerry would waste cheese breaking pots, I don't know, but these are all just for the sake of high score hunting. It really feels like all these slightly varied types of gameplay are mostly here just to pad the game out. Without these, you could probably beat the game in something like 15 or 20 minutes. No exaggeration. Tom and Jerry Tales also got a Game Boy Advance release. It's different, as you would expect, but it does kind of follow the same design philosophy. Each room is once again its own level. This time though, they kind of act like a hub level. You follow the trail of cheese which leads to the minigame. Go through each minigame in order, and you can move on to the next room, and repeat. The minigames themselves range from platforming stages where you collect all the cheese and reach the end, to varying styles of one-on-one fights with Tom, where you use elements of the environment to your advantage, usually having the end result of bonking Tom on the head. Why does the house have so many toasters? Why does plain fruit cause Tom and Jerry to wail in pain? It doesn't matter. It's all just ways to implement basic household items into these minigames. The platforming segments last the longest by far, and are probably the most engaging parts to actually play, though they are a little bit simple. Jerry can sprint through them, but there's no time limit this time, so I don't really know why you'd risk hitting one of the obstacles. When he jumps though, he'll curl into a ball, like Sonic the Hedgehog, this making him one of the more athletic Jerrys we've seen so far. Just like the DS version, we're looking at another 1 hour experience, and you can't even go back and replay any of the minigames, so there's a built-in lack of replayability. The game is functional, it's reasonably loyal to the spirit of Tom and Jerry, and it's the right kind of difficulty to be a good option for younger children. Everyone else will exhaust the game of content in no time at all. Back onto mid-2000s mobile phones, for Tom and Jerry Pinball Pursuit, coming out in 2006. Anyway, I'm sure you know what to expect here. It's Pinball. It's Java-based, being a mobile game from the mid-2000s, so it's not going to take you by surprise. Perhaps the oddest thing is you play using Jerry's overjoyed, disembodied head as the ball. There are 3 tables to play on, all based on classic cartoon locations. It's a little bit jittery, the timing feels a little bit out of sync, but somehow it's nowhere near enough to make it difficult to play. It works. It's fine for its purpose. Grab your phone, play a little bit of pinball, kill the time, get a high score, wait until next time. I'm a pinball fan, and I gotta say, I actually played a little bit more of this one than I ever expected, so hey, not a bad option. Coming to mobiles in 2008, we get Tom and Jerry Mouse Maze. Now, just because phones are smart, don't expect anything too special. It's another cheese collector with Pac-Man inspired gameplay. I can't believe I'm using cheese collector as a video game genre. You don't have to collect all the cheese to beat a level, you just have to get enough to open an exit. The more you get though, the higher the score, and this is a high score chasing kind of game. Jump over the obstacles, avoid Tom and the other cats that get in the way. Nice that we have some different cats this time. Not bad, but by 2008, this Java-style mobile game is starting to show its age. Well, it's almost like they knew what I was going to say, because fast forward a decade, and Mouse Maze got a release on iOS. It's practically a whole new game. Has the same general idea, collect the cheese to progress. This time there are specific types of cheese. The red blocks are what you need to progress through the level. The others are, surprise surprise, used as a currency. To guide Jerry across the stage, you drag your finger along the route you want to take him. At first, it does feel a little awkward because doing so blocks the screen with your finger. But to be fair, it never really gave me any trouble. Every time Tom came along, I thought he was going to catch me because touch-style controls don't really match up with real-time dodging in this way, but it never happened. I think the idea is you're supposed to be more stealthy. You've got objects to hide inside and a number of ways to stay out of their line of sight. Occasionally, you'll get a completely different style of gameplay come along. Things like match 3 puzzles or auto-running stages, just to mix things up, I guess. Now, I mentioned cheese as a currency earlier, being that we've hit the modern era of mobile games. It's got microtransactions. It's the classic 2 forms of currency, each of which you can purchase for real-world money to unlock cards. These cards contain buffs and bonuses that you can use, but I don't think I'm going to be playing this anywhere near often enough to justify making any purchases. Overall though, it's not a bad little puzzle game for your phone, and far from the worst that modern mobile gaming has to offer. We're sticking with this kind of era of mobile gaming now, as we get into 2014 and the release of Tom and Jerry Learn and Play on iOS and Android. Now, this is the first time I'm encountering a problem because it has since been removed from the App Store. It does, however, have an official YouTube channel where we can get a very good idea of what to expect. A reasonably well-presented, very, very simple game aimed at younger children. We're talking matching pairs, spot the difference, colouring in. You can find a million of these educational games that don't really contain much in the form of education, just a word they bust out to convince parents to buy these games for their kids. This one is only different by the presence of Tom and Jerry. I can imagine that it wasn't particularly successful. The YouTube channel alone barely has any views, and it got removed from the App Store, so I'm guessing they found no reason to renew the license. And last and kinda least, because it's another tough one to play, it's Tom and Jerry Chase. Now it seems that for licensing or similar kinds of reasons, this game is only available to download on app stores in Asia. So I was ready to throw in the towel and just watch one of the many YouTube videos this one guy has uploaded, as well as figure out as much info I can from this very detailed wiki page, which at the very least is a good indicator of the amount of content available for this game. But then, by some miracle, I found a version of the game that appeared to work only through Android emulation on PC. I thought I'd nailed it, but I hit a brick wall when the game wanted me, or should I say needed me, to input a Chinese ID number to make sure I was old enough to play it. There's a good amount of content covering this game out there if you know where to look. Not much of it is in English, as it never found its way to a predominantly English-speaking nation, so you might have to rely on translations, but from what I can gather, it's a 4-on-1 game with 4 mice versus 1 cat. The mice have to complete specific objectives, while the cat tries to stop them. I'm sure there's way more to it, but without being able to play, all I can rely on is this footage. It sure looks nice, maybe a little chaotic, but that might just be because I don't understand exactly what people are trying to do, and I'm also not exactly sure of how much of an effect microtransactions have on the game. I'm pretty sure they are there, so the level of enjoyability may be heavily impacted by how much you have to spend to have good enough characters and abilities. Maybe this will someday reach the West and I can give it a proper go, which would be the ideal way to play, because even if I did get it working earlier through emulation, it would have been played on a PC, clicking instead of using a touchscreen, and also all in Chinese, so it's not like I would be getting the intended experience in the first place. It's been a good few years since this first came out. It came out way back in 2019, so I'm not going to hold out for Tom and Jerry Chase making its way over here.
Well, that's all, folks. Yeah, I know, that's Looney Tunes, but anyway, that's all the Tom and Jerry games that were ever released. Honourable mention, I guess, to any browser-based titles that came and went over the years. I imagine half of those have been lost to time at this point. I suppose this does beg the question as well. Which game is the most Tom and Jerry? What stands above all the rest? And yeah, it's tough because I don't really recommend any of these games, generally speaking. Like, you'd have to very specifically ask me, which Tom and Jerry game should I play? I suppose War of the Whiskers isn't a bad option. I've still got it here next to me from when I shot that shot earlier. Yeah, in multiplayer, I suppose this would be your best option because it's the most functional. It looks the best. It's not really saying much though, is it? A fair few of the old platformers and old mobile titles are just fine too, but they're a bit bland, they're unpolished, they're not going to keep you for very long. I think I may just have to label Tom and Jerry as a fairly skippable video game franchise, at least in its current state. They're not all terrible, but none of them are truly worth taking time out of your day to experience, especially with every other game coming out at the moment. Maybe one day we'll get the definitive Tom and Jerry experience, but I wouldn't count on it.